There is a photograph that surfaces occasionally in trucking history collections that stops people who understand what they are looking at. A cab over Pete, probably a 1972 or 1973 model, sitting at a fuel stop somewhere in the American Southwest. The driver is leaning against the front bumper. He has a cigarette going. There is a coffee thermos on the hood, and behind him, visible through the open passenger window, is what appears to be an improvised sleeping arrangement constructed from plywood and foam rubber that fills the entire space behind the seats where a modern truck would have a certified sleeper berth with federally mandated dimensions, ventilation requirements, and occupant protection standards. Nobody took that photograph to document illegal activity. At the time, everything in it was completely normal. The sleeping arrangement, the driving hours that made it necessary, the load securing methods visible on the flatbed behind the trailer, the weight distribution that experienced observers can identify as problematic from the way the tractor sits. All of it was normal. All of it was accepted industry practice, and virtually all of it would generate federal citations, substantial fines, and in some cases, criminal liability if replicated on an American highway in the present day. The 1970s were not a lawless period in American trucking. There were regulations. There were hours of service rules, weight limits, and licensing requirements. But the enforcement infrastructure, the regulatory framework, and the cultural norms surrounding what constituted acceptable practice were so fundamentally different from the present that the decade might as well be a different country operating under a different legal system. This is a forensic examination of 10 specific practices that 1970s truck drivers routinely employed, that the industry accepted as professional operating procedure, and that would be unambiguously illegal under the current federal regulatory framework, with specific attention to the engineering and economic logic that made each practice feel rational at the time, and the documented consequences that eventually forced the regulatory response. The first practice was logbook falsification, so systemic and normalized that it had its own industry vocabulary. The paper logbook that governed hours of service compliance in the 1970s was a grid system that drivers were required to complete showing their duty status: driving, on duty, not driving, sleeper berth, or off duty, across a 24-hour period. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations specified maximum driving hours and required rest periods that, if followed literally, would have made the freight economics of the 1970s long-haul industry unworkable for a significant fraction of the loads that carriers were contractually obligated to deliver. The solution that the industry collectively developed was a documentation system that bore a relationship to actual driver behavior that was, at best, approximate, and at worst, entirely fictional. Drivers called them comic books. The logbook was the comic book because everyone understood it was a creative narrative rather than a factual record. A driver running from Los Angeles to Chicago on a deadline that required 38 hours of continuous operation would maintain 2 logbooks, one showing a legally compliant sequence of driving and rest periods that documented compliance with the regulations, and one showing the actual sequence of events that moved the freight. The compliant book was presented to enforcement officials. The actual record, if it existed at all, stayed with the driver. The practice was so widespread that enforcement officials who stopped trucks for inspections operated with the pragmatic understanding that the logbook they were reviewing represented a legal fiction, and that their enforcement activity was essentially theatrical, unless they had specific evidence of a fatigue-related incident to investigate. The consequence of this system was not merely regulatory non-compliance. It was a generation of drivers running on levels of accumulated sleep deprivation that current fatigue science would classify as cognitively equivalent to measurable blood alcohol impairment. The correlation between hours of service violations documented in post-accident investigations and the accident events themselves was, by the 1980s, generating data that made the 1970s enforcement posture indefensible. The electronic logging device mandate that became fully effective in 2019 was the direct regulatory descendant of the recognition that paper logbooks were structurally incapable of producing honest compliance records. A falsified ELD record requires active manipulation of a certified electronic system in a way that generates its own audit trail. The comic book required nothing more than a pen and a willingness to write numbers that were not true. The second practice was operating combination vehicles at weights that exceeded posted limits through a combination of route selection, timing, and relationship management with enforcement personnel that constituted, in its more developed forms, systematic corruption of the regulatory process. The Federal Bridge Formula, which governs the relationship between axle spacing and permissible axle weights to protect road infrastructure from damage, existed in the 1970s in a form that is recognizable to modern operators. The posted weight limits on interstate highways and state routes also existed. What did not exist was the enforcement infrastructure, the weigh station staffing levels, the portable scale technology, the interagency data sharing, and the legal consequence framework that makes systematic overweight operation the economically irrational choice it is today. Overweight loads in the 1970s were not an exception. They were a standard operating practice in specific freight categories: agricultural hauling, construction material transport, logging, and mining supply. Where the economic pressure to move maximum payload per trip was intense and the perceived probability of a weight enforcement encounter that produced a meaningful consequence was low. Drivers and carriers in these sectors developed detailed knowledge of which weigh stations were staffed on which days and during which shifts, which enforcement personnel were amenable to informal resolution of compliance discrepancies, and which routes bypassed fixed enforcement infrastructure entirely. This knowledge circulated through the CB radio network and through the informal communication systems of regional trucking communities with the same efficiency and reliability as road condition information. The consequence was systematic infrastructure damage that was real, cumulative, and distributed across the public road network in a way that made it politically difficult to connect to its cause. Bridge deterioration rates in high agricultural traffic corridors during the 1970s were documented at levels that significantly exceeded the engineering model's predictions based on legal traffic loads. The models were not wrong. The traffic was not legal. The third practice was cargo securement methodology that would today generate out-of-service orders before the driver completed the pre-trip inspection. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration's cargo securement rules, in their current form, specify minimum working load limits for tie-down assemblies, minimum numbers of tie-downs based on cargo weight and length, specific anchor point requirements, and documentation standards that leave very little interpretive space for individual driver judgment. These rules exist because the pre-regulatory environment produced cargo securement practices that were, by any objective engineering standard, dangerous. A flatbed driver in the 1970s securing a load of steel pipe, construction equipment, or lumber operated within a framework of informal industry practice that prioritized getting the load secured quickly enough to depart on schedule over engineering the securement system to a specific working load limit. The number of chains or straps used was determined by what felt adequate to the driver based on his experience, which varied enormously. The condition of the securement equipment, chains with worn links, binders with cracked handles, straps with fraying at the end fittings, was evaluated by the same subjective standard. The anchor points used on the trailer were often not rated for the loads being applied to them, because trailer manufacturers of the era did not specify anchor point ratings with the precision that current standards require. The physics of inadequate cargo securement are indifferent to the sincerity of the driver's judgment that the load was adequately secured. A steel pipe that shifts during a lane, change at highway speed, and breaches the side of the trailer generates a projectile moving at the closing speed between the truck and any following vehicle. The documented fatalities attributable to inadequate cargo securement in the pre-regulation era were the direct engineering consequence of treating load securement as a craft skill governed by informal norms, rather than a safety-critical process governed by engineering specifications. The fourth practice was operating with brake systems in conditions of adjustment and component wear that current Commercial Vehicle Safety Alliance inspection standards would classify as immediate out-of-service violations. Brake adjustment in the drum brake systems that equipped virtually all commercial vehicles in the 1970s was a manual process. The slack adjusters that controlled the relationship between the brake chamber stroke and the brake shoe application force required periodic manual adjustment to compensate for lining wear, and the frequency of that adjustment in high-mileage operation was significant. A slack adjuster that was out of adjustment reduced the braking force available at that wheel end, and the cumulative effect of multiple out-of-adjustment brake assemblies across a combination vehicle's axles was a stopping distance increase that could be dramatic, potentially 25 to 40% longer stopping distances compared to a fully adjusted brake system, depending on the number and severity of the out-of-adjustment conditions. Or the normalization of degraded brake performance in 1970s trucking culture was not the product of indifference to safety. It was the product of a maintenance environment in which brake adjustment was genuinely difficult to keep current in a truck logging high annual mileage, in which roadside inspection programs with the technical sophistication to measure brake chamber stroke against a specific specification were not yet consistently deployed, and in which the subjective experience of driving a truck with degraded brakes, which feels normal to a driver who has never experienced the reference condition of a fully adjusted system, provided no internal signal that anything was wrong. Automatic slack adjusters, which are mandatory on new vehicles today and which maintain brake adjustment continuously without manual intervention, as were available in the 1970s but not required. The mandate requiring them on new vehicles came in 1994, driven by accident data that made the stopping distance consequence of manual slack adjuster neglect impossible to rationalize as acceptable. The fifth practice was the transportation of hazardous materials under documentation and placarding practices that would today constitute federal criminal violations under the Hazardous Materials Transportation Act. The regulatory framework governing hazardous materials transportation in the 1970s existed, but was in an early developmental state that left significant gaps between the categories of materials requiring specific handling, documentation, and placarding, and the actual universe of materials that presented genuine hazard potential in transportation accidents. When carriers and drivers operating in industrial freight markets transported materials that current hazmat classification would require specific training, specific vehicle equipment, specific route pre-authorization in some cases, and specific emergency response documentation, transported them with informal documentation practices and without the placarding that would allow emergency responders arriving at an accident scene to identify what they were dealing with before making approach and intervention decisions. The consequence of inadequate hazmat identification in accident scenarios was not theoretical. Emergency responders who approached accident scenes involving industrial chemicals, compressed gases, or flammable liquids without accurate information about the cargo were making approach and intervention decisions in an information vacuum that in documented cases resulted in responder casualties that would not have occurred with accurate hazard identification. The current hazmat transportation regulatory framework, which is genuinely complex and which the industry sometimes treats as regulatory overreach, was built incident by incident from the documented consequences of the information gaps that the 1970s framework left unaddressed. The sixth practice was operating commercial vehicles without the physical qualification standards that current federal motor carrier safety regulations require, and specifically without the medical examination process that is designed to identify conditions that impair safe vehicle operation. The Department of Transportation physical examination requirement for commercial vehicle operators existed in the 1970s, but was administered through a process that, compared to current standards, left substantial room for examinations that reflected what the driver needed the examination to show rather than what his actual medical status indicated. The examination itself was less rigorous in its specific screening requirements. Sleep apnea screening, cardiovascular stress testing, and vision testing protocols have all become more demanding over the intervening decades. And the certification process was not yet connected to a national database that would prevent a driver whose certificate had been denied or revoked by one examiner from obtaining certification from a different examiner in a different jurisdiction. The medical conditions that are most consequential for commercial vehicle operators: obstructive sleep apnea, cardiovascular disease, diabetes with associated hypoglycemic risk, and uncorrected vision impairment, were present in the 1970s driver population at rates that were not dramatically different from current prevalence because the biological mechanisms that produce these conditions are not historically recent phenomena. The difference is that the current regulatory framework is designed to identify them systematically. The 1970s framework was designed to identify only the most obvious and severe disqualifying conditions, and its administration was sufficiently inconsistent to allow drivers with conditions that impaired their operational safety to maintain commercial operating authority without the medical management that current standards require. The seventh practice was operating with lighting systems in states of partial failure that would today generate multiple driver vehicle inspection report defects and, in roadside inspection, immediate out-of-service orders for the specific violations involved. The electrical systems of 1970s commercial vehicles were, by the standards of current vehicle electrical architecture, primitive. The wiring harnesses that supplied power to marker lights, clearance lights, brake lights, and turn signals were routed through environments, under the cab, along the frame rails, through rubber grommets in sheet metal that hardened and cracked with age and vibration, that produced connection failures, ground faults, and open circuits at a frequency that made fully functional lighting systems an aspirational state rather than a consistent operational reality on high-mileage equipment. Drivers who conducted pre-trip inspections with the thoroughness the regulations required were frequently identifying lighting defects that, if they pulled the truck for repair before departure, would cost them loading appointments, delay freight, and generate friction with dispatchers who were measured on on-time departure performance rather than equipment compliance status. The practical resolution that the industry normalized was a triage approach to lighting defects. Some lights matter more than others, and the ones that matter less can wait until a convenient maintenance opportunity. The problem with this triage approach is that the lights classified as mattering less were almost never the ones that protected the operator from rear-end collision risk. Marker lights and clearance lights that identify the vehicle's width and height profile to approaching traffic in low visibility conditions are the lights that most frequently failed and most frequently got deferred. They are also the lights whose failure contributes most directly to the approach and strike accident pattern. A vehicle whose width profile is not clearly illuminated being struck by traffic that misjudged its position in a lane. The eighth practice was the use of stimulant medications to extend operational driving periods beyond what the driver's physiological state would sustain without pharmacological assistance, in a regulatory and cultural environment that treated this practice as a personal choice rather than a public safety matter. Amphetamine use among long-haul truck drivers in the 1970s was not a secret. It was not even particularly stigmatized within the industry's own cultural framework. The term that the industry used for amphetamines, white crosses, or simply bennies, was part of the working vocabulary of trucking culture in the same way that specific gear selection techniques and fuel stop preferences were part of that vocabulary. The drugs were used instrumentally to extend the waking period beyond the body's natural capacity, in service of the freight economics and delivery schedule, demands that the logbook falsification practice documented in the first section was separately managing. The pharmacology of amphetamine use in this context produced a specific and dangerous operational profile. Amphetamines suppress the subjective experience of fatigue, the feeling of tiredness, without eliminating the cognitive impairment that accompanies sleep deprivation. A driver who has been awake for 24 hours and has used stimulants to manage the subjective discomfort of that fatigue feels more alert than his cognitive performance actually reflects. His reaction times are impaired. his judgment about risk and margin is degraded. His ability to process the multivariable information environment of high-speed highway driving is compromised in ways that he is not equipped to accurately self-assess because the assessment mechanism itself is impaired. This is not a theoretical pharmacological concern. It is a documented operational reality that post-accident toxicology data from the 1970s and 1980s captured with enough consistency to make the connection between stimulant use and fatal accident causation statistically robust. The ninth practice was equipment modification and repair performed outside any certification or inspection framework in ways that altered safety-critical vehicle systems without engineering validation that the modifications met the performance requirements of those systems. The culture of self-maintenance and field repair that characterized owner-operator trucking in the 1970s was, in its legitimate expression, a genuine professional skill set. Drivers who could diagnose and repair their own equipment were economically self-sufficient in a way that drivers dependent on dealer service networks were not. And the mechanical knowledge required to maintain a diesel truck and trailer combination through hundreds of thousands of miles of service was real, hard-won, and practically valuable. The problem was that the same culture that celebrated mechanical self-sufficiency also normalized modifications and repairs to safety-critical systems. Brakes, steering, fifth-wheel assemblies, frame structures, that were performed without reference to engineering specifications, without access to the manufacturer's repair procedures, and without any post-repair inspection to verify that the modification or repair had achieved the performance standard the system required. A brake system repair performed with non-original components that did not match the thermal capacity or friction characteristics of the specified parts could produce a brake system that felt normal in routine operation and failed catastrophically under the thermal stress of a mountain descent or an emergency stop. A frame repair performed by welding that did not match the metallurgical requirements of the frame material could produce a stress concentration at the repair site that propagated into a fatigue crack under the cyclic loading of highway operation. If these failure modes were not reliably detectable by the driver operating the repaired vehicle, and they were not being systematically identified by the roadside inspection program of the era. The 10th practice was operating combination vehicles in adverse weather conditions, specifically ice and snow, with tire and chain equipment standards and driving technique training that current winter operations best practices would classify as seriously inadequate for the conditions being attempted. Winter operation of heavily loaded combination vehicles on mountain passes and in northern highway corridors in the 1970s was governed by a combination of state chain laws which varied in their specificity and consistency of enforcement, and the individual driver's assessment of whether his equipment and skill level were adequate for the conditions ahead. The chain laws of the era were less specific in their traction device requirements than current regulations in many states, and enforcement in remote mountain corridor locations was intermittent enough that compliance decisions were effectively left to driver judgment in a significant fraction of cases. The tires available for winter commercial vehicle operation in the 1970s were substantially less capable than current winter-rated commercial tire technology in terms of their cold temperature compound performance and tread design effectiveness on compacted snow and ice. A driver operating a fully loaded combination vehicle on a 6% mountain grade in icy conditions with the tire technology and chain installation practices of the 1970s was operating with traction margins that current winter operations training would classify as insufficient for the attempted maneuver, and doing so in a vehicle without the anti-lock braking systems, traction control, or stability control technology that gives modern combination vehicles a fighting chance of recovering from a traction loss event before it develops into an uncontrolled slide. The accident data from mountain corridor winter operations in the 1970s reflects these inadequacies with a clarity that makes the subsequent regulatory response. More specific chain laws, more consistent enforcement. Mandatory ABS on new commercial vehicles from 1997 onward look like the minimum necessary rather than an overreaction to isolated incidents. The runaway truck ramps that scar the descending lanes of mountain passes across the American West are physical infrastructure built from the lesson inventory of the 1970s operating environment. They are there because the practices of that era made them necessary, and they remain there because the physics of a loaded combination vehicle that has lost braking control on a steep grade have not changed even as the practices that most frequently produced that condition have been largely regulated out of existence. The 1970s truck driver who navigated all of these practices successfully, who ran the hours, managed the weights, secured the loads with informal methods, and brought the freight through, was not a reckless person. He was a pragmatic professional, operating within the norms of his industry and his era, making decisions that the information environment and the regulatory framework of that time classified as acceptable. The regulations that subsequently made those practices illegal were not generated by regulators who had discovered something that the drivers did not know. They were generated by data that documented, with increasing specificity, what happened when those practices intersected with the irreducible variability of the highway environment at the wrong moment. The regulations are the record of those intersections. Reading them carefully tells you exactly what the 1970s cost.